Under the dazzling glare of studio lights and before a captivated nation, the stage was transformed into an arena of ideas and character. Millions of eyes, both in the studio and across countless television screens, focused on an encounter that promised to challenge preconceived notions. In this high-stakes environment, an experienced television host, renowned for his razor-sharp intellect and his ability to unmask the vulnerabilities of the powerful, prepared to dismantle his guest with a series of meticulously crafted questions and subtle psychological maneuvers. The host, a veteran journalist known for his relentless pursuit of truth on live television, was celebrated and reviled in equal measure. His career had been built on cornering even the most formidable political figures and business magnates, leaving them exposed under the unforgiving glare of his scrutiny. Tonight, however, his target was not a seasoned politician, but a young man whose very presence stirred debate, a young man born into a name that commanded attention, yet whose own path remained shrouded in mystery. Barron Trump, a figure whose public appearances were rare and whose every move was observed with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive, stepped onto the stage with a quiet dignity that defied expectations. Clad in an impeccably tailored dark suit, his every step was measured, his presence exuding an unshakable calm. Unlike the frenetic energy that often accompanies those unaccustomed to the glare of public scrutiny, Barron moved with a grace and restraint that belied his youth and the burden of a legacy he did not choose. His expression was one of quiet confidence, reserved yet potent, a stark contrast to the bombastic bravado often expected from the scions of prominent families. In that charged moment, the tension in the studio was palpable. The audience, comprising hundreds of live viewers and millions more watching from afar, was poised on the edge of anticipation. Every element of the setting, from the dramatic lighting that carved sharp shadows across the stage to the subtle hum of the production equipment, conspired to create a sense of foreboding and possibility. This was not merely another interview, it was a confrontation of ideologies, an exploration of identity under relentless public pressure. The host's agenda was clear: to unmask the enigma that was Barron Trump, to force him to articulate his identity and the principles by which he wished to live. Every question had been designed to unsettle, to probe the depths of a young man whose life had been intricately intertwined with the expectations and controversies of his family name. The host, confident in his ability to break his guests under the weight of his inquiries, anticipated a display of hesitation or even collapse, a narrative that the public might find both predictable and satisfying. But what no one expected was that the young man seated opposite him would not only withstand the pressure, but would, through his quiet resolve, invert the dynamics of the encounter. As the first moments of the interview unfolded, the stage became a microcosm of a larger battle, a battle where the weapons were words. The arena was the public sphere, and the true victor would be determined not by bluster, but by the strength of character. The opening sequence was a masterclass in tension building, the seasoned host flipping through his notes, his eyes glittering with anticipation as he prepared to launch a series of questions meant to pry open the guarded front of his guest. And yet, Barron Trump, with his unruffled demeanor and steady, contemplative gaze, signaled that he was a participant who would not be easily manipulated. In that moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge the conventional narratives of privilege and expectation, a confrontation where a young man could redefine his identity on his own terms, beyond the shadow of a name that had both opened doors and imposed heavy burdens. The stage was illuminated not only by brilliant lights, but by the potential for transformation, a potential that would soon leave America in a state of awe. As the interview progressed, the host initiated his relentless onslaught of probing questions, each one crafted with the precision of a seasoned interrogator. The questions ranged from inquiries about the weight of the illustrious family name to subtle challenges about the very nature of privilege and responsibility. With each question, the atmosphere in the studio grew denser, as if the weight of public expectation and historical baggage were pressing down upon the stage. The host's strategy was clear: to unsettle his guest by highlighting the controversies and burdens associated with the Trump name, to force a confession of either undue pride or unwarranted naivety. He raised questions about whether the legacy of power and wealth had ever felt like a burden to the young man, and whether growing up in an environment marked by intense media scrutiny had rendered him out of touch with the realities faced by ordinary citizens. Every word was designed to provoke a reaction, to elicit a crack in the facade that many had assumed was unbreakable. Yet amid the barrage of pointed inquiries, Barron Trump maintained an almost disconcerting composure. His responses were measured and introspective, delivered with a clarity that suggested both self-awareness and an unyielding commitment to defining his own identity. Rather than falling into the traps laid before him, he deftly turned each question on its head, challenging the very assumptions that underpinned the host's line of attack. When confronted with the notion of a burden, he acknowledged the responsibilities inherent in his heritage, but he emphasized that the true challenge lay in how one chooses to bear those responsibilities. The studio, filled with an audience attuned to every nuance, witnessed a masterful demonstration of restraint and deflection. The young man's answers were not brash proclamations, nor evasive dodges. They were thoughtful reflections that placed the focus back on the principles of accountability and personal integrity. In this silent exchange of ideas, Barron transformed what was meant to be an assault on his character into an opportunity to articulate a vision of leadership that transcended mere inheritance. His responses underscored a belief that a name, no matter how storied, was not destiny. Rather, it was the choices one made and the values one upheld that truly defined an individual. The host, who had spent years perfecting the art of psychological pressure on his guests, found himself increasingly disarmed by the young man's unflappable demeanor. Every attempt to corner him was met with a calm, reasoned counter that redirected the conversation toward broader questions of transparency, trust, and the nature of public service. The audience, initially anticipating a spectacle of hesitation or defensive rhetoric, was instead drawn into a quieter, more profound dialogue about identity and the future of leadership. Within the confines of the studio, a subtle but powerful transformation was taking place. Barron Trump was not simply enduring the barrage of questions, he was actively redefining the parameters of the conversation. His answers, delivered with an almost disarming sincerity, resonated with the idea that true leadership is not inherited by virtue of a name, but earned through actions that reflect one's core principles. The host's carefully constructed traps began to crumble under the weight of this unexpected shift. What had started as an attempt to dismantle a young man in front of millions turned into a showcase of resilience, a silent yet eloquent declaration that the measure of a person lies in the content of their character, not in the legacy they carry. As the tension in the studio mounted, the host shifted his focus from questions of privilege to more personal and emotionally charged inquiries. He sought to probe the internal struggles that might lie beneath the surface, a challenge aimed at revealing any fissures in the carefully maintained veneer of confidence. Yet even as he delved into territory meant to unbalance his guest, Barron's responses were imbued with a quiet, unwavering certainty. He acknowledged that every individual experiences setbacks and moments of perceived failure, but he framed these experiences as opportunities for growth and self-definition rather than as markers of inherent inadequacy. The interplay between the host's relentless scrutiny and the young man's measured deflection created an atmosphere of intellectual tension that captivated the audience. Each question, each carefully timed pause was met with a response that was both a rejection of simplistic narratives and an invitation to re-examine the deeper issues at play. The studio lights, casting dramatic shadows across the set, seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the very essence of the battle being waged. A battle for the right to define oneself in an era where public perception is as powerful as any policy. In this unfolding drama, the boundaries between attacker and defender blurred. The host, accustomed to the thrill of overpowering his guests, began to realize that he was witnessing a reversal of expectations. The young man before him was not merely a reluctant participant in a media spectacle. He was an individual of remarkable intellect and poise, challenging the very framework of the interview itself. The seeds of admiration began to sprout among the viewers, who recognized that this was more than a clash of personalities. It was a profound contest of ideas, a contest where the strength of one's convictions could redefine the narrative. As the interview advanced into deeper and more personal territories, the psychological stakes reached a fever pitch. The host, ever the tactician, sought to unearth any trace of vulnerability in the young man's past, a moment of failure, a lapse of judgment, or a sign of weakness that could be exploited for dramatic effect. In this moment, the stage was set for a battle not of physical might, but of mental acuity and emotional resilience. The host's questions became increasingly pointed, designed to pry open the hidden recesses of the guest's identity. He navigated through topics that most would consider too sensitive or too divisive, aiming to entangle the young man in a web of expectations and public perceptions. Every question was laced with insinuations about the nature of privilege and the weight of legacy. The host questioned whether the burdens of a famous family had ever made the young man feel isolated or disconnected from the everyday struggles of ordinary people. His tone was both challenging and probing, a calculated effort to elicit a response that might reveal cracks in the facade. Yet for every attempt to expose vulnerability, Barron countered with a measured calm that was as disarming as it was insightful. Instead of providing simple answers that would fit neatly into the host's preconceived narrative, he embraced the complexity of his experience. His reflections delved into the nuances of personal growth, suggesting that failure and success were not binary states, but part of a continuous journey towards self-discovery. In his quiet, deliberate manner, he conveyed that the true test of character lay not in the absence of failure, but in the willingness to learn from it and to redefine one's identity on one's own terms. This act of self-definition, so artfully executed, resonated with the audience. The young man's ability to turn what could have been a moment of weakness into a powerful statement of resilience was nothing short of extraordinary. He articulated a vision of leadership that was not predicated on inherited power or unchallenged authority, but on the relentless pursuit of truth, accountability, and personal integrity. His narrative was one of transformation, a journey marked by the willingness to face harsh realities and emerge stronger from the crucible of public scrutiny. The studio became a psychological battlefield where every glance, every pause carried the weight of unspoken challenges. The host's attempts to pin down a definitive stance were met with a series of thoughtful, reflective responses that not only deflected the inquiry, but also broadened its scope. The young man's perspective was clear. A name, no matter how significant, was merely a starting point. What truly mattered was the person behind the name, the choices made, the values upheld, and the vision for the future. In this light, the host's personal probes became opportunities for the young man to expound upon his beliefs, to articulate a philosophy that transcended conventional political dichotomies. The audience watching this cerebral duel unfold was drawn into the gravity of the exchange. The tension in the room was palpable. Every viewer sensed that they were witnessing a turning point in public discourse. Here, in the microcosm of a television studio, the conversation had shifted from petty political jabs to an exploration of what it truly meant to be a leader in a modern, divided society. The young man's unwavering composure under pressure challenged not only the assumptions of the host, but also those of a nation that had grown accustomed to the spectacle of televised confrontations. In that charged environment, the stakes extended beyond personal reputation or political destiny. They touched on the very essence of American identity. The exchange invited viewers to consider whether leadership should be inherited or earned, whether public life should be defined by the legacies of the past or by the innovative visions of a new generation. The silent, powerful assertion that one's future is self-determined struck a chord with many, stirring an undercurrent of hope and possibility in a public discourse often dominated by cynicism and division. The psychological nuances of the conversation reached a crescendo when the host, pushing his own boundaries of inquiry, attempted to confront the young man with the most personal of questions. Questions that pierced the veil of public perception and delved into the realm of internal doubt. The room held its breath, and for a fleeting moment, the balance of power seemed to teeter precariously, yet the young man's response was the masterstroke of self-assurance. His carefully measured words transformed a potential trap into a moment of profound clarity, a declaration that true failure lies not in the missteps of the past, but in the surrender to the judgments of others. As the interview progressed, every challenge posed by the host was met with a response that was both a defense and an affirmation of self. The young man's ability to remain unshaken, to answer even the most incisive questions with a calm introspection, redefined the nature of the confrontation. What had begun as an attempt to dismantle his character had evolved into a demonstration of inner strength, a testament to the idea that authenticity, when rooted in self-awareness, can defy even the most aggressive of critiques. This psychological battlefield, fought not with weapons but with words and ideas, left an indelible mark on the studio and on the hearts of those watching. The encounter became a powerful narrative of self-determination, a narrative that resonated far beyond the confines of live television, challenging the public to rethink the metrics by which leaders are judged. In that moment, the young man's refusal to be defined by his legacy emerged as a claim clarion call to a generation yearning for authenticity and hope. In the aftermath of the psychological duel, the focus of the interview shifted from the host's relentless inquiries to the broader implications of the young man's vision for the future. What emerged was not merely a defense of personal identity, but an expansive declaration about the nature of leadership, responsibility, and the evolving political landscape. The conversation had transcended the narrow confines of personal legacy and had blossomed into an exploration of the values that underpin the future of a nation. The young man's responses, delivered with unwavering conviction, challenged the conventional wisdom that equated privilege with entitlement. Instead, he posited that a legacy, no matter how storied, was only as meaningful as the actions taken to honor it. In his measured and thoughtful manner, he conveyed that the true measure of a leader lies not in the shadow of familial achievements, but in the ability to forge a new path, guided by principles of transparency, accountability, and genuine connection with the people. This new vision for leadership resonated with an audience that had long grown weary of political theater and empty rhetoric. The young man's perspective was refreshingly unorthodox. He acknowledged the weight of his family name and the expectations that came with it, yet he made it clear that these factors would not dictate his choices. Instead, he embraced the idea that every individual, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, had the power, and indeed the responsibility, to shape their own destiny. The notion that the future should be built on merit, on the ability to listen to the concerns of the public, and on a commitment to reforming a system marred by division and mistrust, struck a deep chord with those watching. As the interview unfolded, the atmosphere in the studio became charged with a sense of possibility. The host, who had prided himself on his ability to corner his guests, found himself on the back foot as the young man began to turn the narrative in his favor. With each response, he not only deflected the host's probing questions, but also illuminated a broader dialogue about the responsibilities of those in power. The exchange became a powerful reminder that the future was not predetermined by past glories or missteps, but was instead shaped by the courage to innovate and to challenge the status quo. In this unfolding narrative, the young man's insights began to reveal a deep understanding of the challenges facing modern society. He spoke of the need for a political system that was more inclusive, one that listened to the voices of those who had long been marginalized. He argued that true progress was achieved not through clinging to the familiar, but by daring to envision and implement new solutions. Solutions that were rooted in a genuine desire to serve the public good rather than to uphold entrenched interests. His words, though delivered without fanfare or grandiose rhetoric, carried an immense weight, a weight that seemed to lift the collective spirit of the audience and inspire them to reconsider the possibilities for the future. Throughout this segment of the interview, the host's aggressive tactics began to lose their edge. The young man's steady, articulate responses had a transformative effect, shifting the conversation away from personal attacks and toward a substantive discussion of vision and values. The host, once a master of dissecting his subjects with cutting questions, now found that the battle had changed its course. The energy in the studio shifted from confrontation to contemplation, as the audience absorbed a message that transcended partisan divides, a message that the future of leadership depended on authenticity, resilience, and the unwavering commitment to one's ideals. For many viewers, this moment was more than just a televised debate. It was a turning point in the public discourse. The young man's insistence that a name does not define one's destiny, and that the future should be forged by those willing to challenge the norms, resonated as a beacon of hope in a time marked by division and uncertainty. His words, imbued with a quiet yet formidable determination, served as an invitation to look beyond the superficial labels that too often constrained our understanding of potential and possibility. As the interview entered its final phase, the focus turned toward the host's final attempt to wrest control of the narrative, with one last high-stakes question designed to evoke a definitive stance on his family's political legacy. The host sought to trap the young man in a dichotomy that would force him to choose between loyalty and independent thought. But the young man, undeterred by the pressure of public scrutiny, once again redefined the terms of the debate. His response, delivered with a calm yet resolute conviction, underscored the idea that leadership is not a matter of predetermined roles, but of personal choice, a choice that must be made with the courage to defy expectation and to embrace one's own path. In this climactic moment, the interview reached its zenith. The studio fell into a profound silence as the young man's declaration echoed through the room, a declaration that he would not be confined by the expectations of the past, nor would he allow others to dictate the course of his future. The impact of his words was immediate and far-reaching, leaving the audience with a sense of awe and a renewed belief in the power of individual agency. In that moment, the narrative shifted irrevocably. The young man was no longer defined by his heritage, but was emerging as a force in his own right, ready to shape his destiny and, by extension, the destiny of a nation in need of fresh perspectives. Following the electrifying exchange in the studio, the ripple effects of the encounter began to spread far beyond the confines of the television set. In the days that followed, media outlets, social commentators, and the general public were abuzz with analysis and debate over what had transpired on that live broadcast. Headlines emerged that spoke not merely of a confrontation between a seasoned host and a young scion, but of a moment that had redefined public discourse. A moment when the narrative was reclaimed by a young man who refused to be confined by the legacy of his name. Across the nation, viewers who had witnessed the interview found themselves reflecting on the power of self-definition. Discussions ignited in cafes, at dinner tables, and on social media platforms about the nature of leadership, the burdens of privilege, and the courage required to carve out one's own identity in an age dominated by expectation and spectacle. For many, the young man's measured responses and thoughtful reframing of contentious issues served as a potent reminder that authenticity and introspection could prevail over the barrage of political rhetoric and partisan bickering. The public reaction was multifaceted. Some praised the young man's intellectual poise and his ability to transform potentially damaging questions into opportunities to articulate a vision of integrity and reform. Others marveled at how a figure, long associated with a storied and controversial family, could so elegantly deflect the host's aggressive tactics, thereby inspiring a renewed sense of hope and possibility. The narrative was no longer simply about the burden of a name, but about the potential for growth and change that lies within every individual willing to rise above the constraints of expectation. In the wake of the interview, the young man's newfound stance began to have tangible repercussions. Public opinion polls and social media sentiment reflected a growing admiration for his composure and clarity of purpose. Analysts noted that his performance had set a new benchmark for how public figures could engage with the media, not as pawns of their heritage, but as autonomous individuals capable of articulating a distinct and progressive vision for the future. The broadcast, which had initially been anticipated as another instance of media sensationalism, evolved into a symbol of intellectual resilience, a beacon for those who believed that true leadership was about substance rather than spectacle. As the national conversation evolved, so too did the way in which the young man was perceived by the public. No longer seen merely as a beneficiary of a powerful legacy, he began to emerge as a figure who could potentially chart a new course in the realm of public service. His measured responses, his willingness to challenge the status quo, and his refusal to be boxed in by the labels assigned to him had collectively forged an image of a leader in the making, a leader who would be judged not by the actions of his forebears, but by his own choices and the values he espoused. Behind the scenes, the reverberations of the interview spurred a flurry of discussions among political commentators, think tanks, and cultural critics. Forums and panel discussions sprang up, dissecting every moment of the broadcast and debating its implications for the future of American politics. The encounter became a case study in the power of narrative control, a vivid illustration of how a single moment on live television could challenge entrenched assumptions about privilege, accountability, and the essence of leadership. Moreover, the interview served as a catalyst for a broader cultural movement. It inspired a wave of introspection among young leaders and aspiring public figures who saw in the young man's performance a blueprint for how to engage with a demanding public while staying true to one's core principles. Educational institutions and civic organizations began to reference the encounter in discussions about media literacy, the ethics of public discourse, and the importance of critical thinking in an age dominated by sound bites and sensationalism. Even the seasoned host, whose career had been built on dismantling his guests with precise and often ruthless questioning, was forced to reckon with the implications of the encounter. In subsequent reflections and interviews, he acknowledged, albeit indirectly, the transformative nature of what had transpired on that stage. The experience had challenged him to re-examine his own methods and the broader impact of his approach to journalism, highlighting the delicate balance between probing inquiry and the risk of overshadowing the genuine voices of those he sought to question. Thus, the aftermath of the interview was not confined to the ephemeral realm of television ratings or fleeting media buzz. It became a lasting chapter in the national dialogue about identity, responsibility, and the future of leadership in America. The young man's performance was heralded as a turning point, a moment when a new generation signaled its readiness to redefine the rules of engagement in the public sphere, to reject the notion that legacy alone should determine one's destiny, and to embrace the idea that true merit is forged in the crucible of personal conviction and hard-won experience. In the weeks and months following the landmark interview, the resonance of that fateful broadcast continued to shape the national consciousness. The encounter, which had once unfolded live on television under the intense scrutiny of millions, evolved into a lasting narrative, a story of personal resilience, intellectual courage, and the power to redefine one's identity against all odds. The young man who had so masterfully steered the conversation and emerged unscathed from an onslaught of probing questions began to chart his own course in the complex landscape of public life. No longer would he be seen merely as a byproduct of a storied family legacy. Instead, he embraced the challenge of forging a new path, one defined not by the expectations of a bygone era, but by the promise of a future built on personal merit, transparency, and an unwavering commitment to public service. His performance on that televised stage became the cornerstone of a new identity, a declaration that he would not allow the weight of his family name to dictate his future. Rather, he would forge his own destiny through the strength of his convictions and the clarity of his vision for a better society. In the wake of the interview, the young man found himself at the crossroads of opportunity and responsibility. Invitations to engage in public discourse, participate in policy forums, and collaborate with emerging leaders began to pour in. These opportunities were not merely endorsements of his newfound stance. They represented a seismic shift in how the public viewed leadership and the qualities necessary to drive meaningful change. The narrative that had been constructed on that stage of a young man who refused to be defined by inherited privilege soon spread beyond the confines of the broadcast, inspiring countless others to re-examine their own beliefs and the ways in which they measured success. As he stepped into this new phase, the young man carried with him the lessons learned under the intense spotlight of live television. He understood that true leadership was not about conforming to established norms or appeasing entrenched interests, but about having the courage to ask difficult questions, to challenge the status quo, and to build bridges between disparate worlds. His journey was a testament to the idea that the future belonged to those who were willing to engage in honest self-reflection and to take bold, sometimes unconventional steps toward creating a more inclusive and accountable society. In quiet moments of reflection, he would recall the intensity of that interview, the calculated probes, the near overwhelming pressure of expectation, and the remarkable inner strength that allowed him to rise above it all. These memories became a wellspring of inspiration, fueling his determination to not only succeed on his own terms, but also to empower others who had long felt marginalized or silenced by a system that too often prized legacy over innovation. The ripple effects of that defining moment soon extended into the broader cultural and political arenas. Educational institutions, civic organizations, and grassroots movements began to reference the interview as a turning point, a powerful example of how authentic dialogue and the courage to challenge convention could spark lasting change. The young man's stance was celebrated not merely as a personal triumph, but as a clarion call to a generation that yearned for leaders who were both reflective and resolute, capable of bridging the gap between the old guard and a new, more dynamic vision for the future. In his subsequent endeavors, whether speaking at public forums or contributing to policy discussions, the young man remained true to the principles that had defined that moment on live television. He advocated for a political culture that valued transparency and accountability, urging citizens and leaders alike to focus on substantive issues rather than the superficial trappings of power. His message was clear and enduring that a name, no matter how illustrious, does not determine one's destiny. Actions, ideas, and the willingness to embrace change do. Moreover, the legacy of that historic interview began to influence how media approached the critical task of public discourse. Journalists and media professionals, inspired by the young man's exemplary poise and clarity, started to reimagine the role of televised debates and interviews. They sought to shift the focus from sensationalism and personal attacks to substantive discussions that explored the complex issues facing society. In this way, the encounter between the seasoned host and the young man became more than just a memorable broadcast. It became a catalyst for reform in the very methods of public engagement and accountability. As the nation moved forward, the story of that defining moment continued to echo through the corridors of power and into the hearts of everyday citizens. It served as a reminder that in a world where the pressures of legacy and expectation can weigh heavily on the individual, there remains an enduring power in the human spirit, the power to redefine oneself, to challenge entrenched narratives, and to build a future that reflects one's deepest values and aspirations. In the end, the young man's journey, illuminated by the unwavering light of his convictions and the silent applause of a nation in awe, became a symbol of hope and transformation. His story was not simply about surviving a high-pressure interview. It was about emerging from that crucible as an individual who could stand on his own, unburdened by the chains of the past, and ready to contribute to a society that honored merit and encouraged innovation. And so, as the final lights dimmed on that historic broadcast and the cameras ceased their relentless gaze, the legacy of that encounter lived on. It became a testament to the belief that true leadership is forged in the fires of adversity, that the courage to speak one's truth can reshape public discourse, and that every individual, no matter the weight of history upon their shoulders, has the power to chart their own course in the world. This was the moment when a young man redefined not only his own identity, but also the very fabric of public expectation, a moment that left an indelible mark on the national consciousness and paved the way for a future where leadership is measured not by the inheritance of a name, but by the strength of one's character and the clarity of one's vision. And as long as there are hearts willing to listen and minds ready to question the status quo, the legacy of that defining moment will continue to inspire new generations to rise, to challenge, and to create a better tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing stories. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. That way you'll never miss our newest uploads.